My dad mocked every achievement I ever had with slow claps and laughter. I used his exact mockery to shame him. Every single time I accomplished something, my dad would do this fake slow clap and laugh like I told the funniest joke in the world. When I made honor roll in 6th grade, he looked at the certificate and said, "Wow, they must be giving those to everyone now." When I got into varsity soccer as a freshman, he laughed and asked if they needed someone to carry water bottles. When I got accepted to college with a partial scholarship, he actually doubled over laughing and said the school must be desperate for tuition money. He'd tell his poker buddies about my achievements like they were comedy sketches, always ending with how standards had really dropped these days. Meanwhile, when Dad got Employee of the Month at his accounting firm, he framed the certificate and made us celebrate at a steakhouse. When he won $50 on a scratch-off, he called everyone he knew. When his boss complimented his spreadsheet organization, he talked about it for 3 weeks straight. But my full ride to graduate school? He laughed so hard he cried and said universities were basically giving away degrees now. My mom would tell me to ignore him, that he was proud in his own way. But I'd watch him at my graduation ceremonies, and while other parents cried with joy, he'd be smirking and shaking his head like the whole thing was ridiculous. When I got my first job at a tech company, he asked if they knew I couldn't even fix the Wi-Fi router at home. When I got promoted within 6 months, he said they probably just needed to fill diversity quotas. The worst part was he'd do this in front of other people. At family gatherings, he'd bring up my accomplishments just to mock them. He'd say things like, "My niece thinks she's special because she got some participation trophy they call a degree now." Or he'd tell his brothers that I got promoted, but it was probably just because my boss felt sorry for me. His brothers would look uncomfortable, but Dad would keep going, explaining how everything was easier now and accomplishments didn't mean what they used to. When I bought my first house at 26, he walked through it laughing at everything. The kitchen was too small, the yard was pathetic, the neighborhood was pretentious. He told me I'd probably lose it in a year when reality hit about what mortgages actually cost. He took pictures, but only to show his friends what kids considered success these days. When I started dating someone serious, he laughed at how I described her and said she was probably just after my tech money. When we got engaged, he told me marriage was for people who couldn't handle being alone. At the wedding, during his speech, he made jokes about how long he gave us and how at least the divorce would teach me about real life. His coworkers who attended looked horrified, but he thought he was hilarious. That's when I found out something interesting. Dad's company was hiring for a new position that would be his boss's boss. They wanted someone with tech experience to modernize their systems. The hiring committee included 3 external consultants who would interview all candidates in panel format. I knew because my company had partnered with them on the search. I made sure to mention to the recruiters that my dad would be perfect for presenting to the panel about why he deserved a promotion, even though he hadn't applied. They thought it was a great idea to see current employees present their value. Dad was thrilled when he got invited to present, not knowing I'd arranged it. He spent weeks preparing his presentation about his 20 years of dedication and experience. The day came and Dad walked into the conference room full of confidence. The panel started with basic questions about his achievements. Dad started listing them, and that's when I walked in as the 4th panel member, the tech consultant they'd brought in to evaluate digital readiness. Dad's face went white, but he had to continue. He talked about his Employee of the Month award, and I did his signature slow clap and laughed. The other panel members looked confused. He mentioned streamlining a process, and I laughed harder, asking if that meant he finally learned to use shortcuts in Excel. Dad tried to continue, but I kept interrupting with his favorite phrases. When he talked about mentoring junior employees, I asked if that meant taking credit for their work. When he mentioned his reliability, I laughed and said showing up was basically participation trophy stuff now. The panel members were getting uncomfortable, but I explained this was just the communication style I'd learned from him, that accomplishments should be met with skepticism and mockery to keep people humble. Dad tried to defend his achievements, but I laughed at each one, saying standards must have really dropped if that counted as success. I asked the panel if they noticed how everything was easier in his generation, and accomplishments didn't mean what they do now. Dad ended up stumbling through the rest of his presentation, while I smirked and shook my head at everything he said. The panel thanked him for coming, but their faces said everything. I stepped out of the conference room and heard the door click shut behind me. The other panel members followed, their shoes making quiet sounds on the hallway carpet. Carson caught my arm and pulled me toward an empty office. His face was red and his jaw was tight. He asked what the hell just happened in there. I could see the other consultants watching us from down the hall, whispering to each other. Carson said that was the most unprofessional interview he'd ever witnessed in 20 years of hiring. His hand was still gripping my arm and I pulled away. I told him I was demonstrating the exact communication style my father used on me for 25 years. Carson's eyes went wide and he took a step back. I explained that Dad deserved to understand how it felt to have every achievement mocked and dismissed. Carson shook his head and said regardless of personal history, what I did was completely inappropriate for a professional hiring panel. He said I humiliated their employee in front of external consultants and made everyone uncomfortable. I started to explain more, but Carson held up his hand. He said he needed to report this to my supervisor and walked away without another word. The next morning, my phone rang before I even got to my desk. Lila's assistant said she needed to see me immediately. I walked to her office and found her standing by the window with her arms crossed. She didn't ask me to sit down. Lila said Carson contacted her last night about my behavior during the panel. Her voice was cold and controlled in a way I'd never heard before. She said I used our company partnership to orchestrate personal revenge, and that could damage our firm's relationship with the accounting company. I tried to explain that Dad had mocked every single achievement I'd ever had. Lila cut me off mid-sentence and said she didn't care about my personal issues. She walked over to her desk and put both hands on it, leaning forward. She told me my personal problems don't excuse sabotaging a professional process. Lila said if I ever pulled something like this again, I'd be terminated immediately. She pointed at the door and told me to get out of her office. I got home that evening and my fiancé was making dinner. She asked how the panel went, and I could tell from her face she already knew something was wrong. I told her what I did and watched her expression change. Her face fell and she put down the knife she was holding. She said she understood I was hurt by Dad's behavior over the years. Then she paused and looked at me for a long time. She said publicly humiliating him at work crossed a line that made me just like him. I felt my chest get tight and started to argue, but she walked out of the kitchen. I stood there alone with the half-chopped vegetables on the counter. The weekend dragged by and I kept replaying everyone's reactions in my head. I felt defensive about the whole thing because none of them understood what it was like. 25 years of having every achievement treated like a joke. Nobody saw Dad laughing at my college acceptance or mocking my job promotion. My fiancé barely spoke to me all weekend, and when she did, her voice was quiet and careful. Sunday night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her words kept echoing in my mind about becoming just like him. My stomach felt sick every time I remembered the look on her face when I told her what I'd done. Monday morning, Mom called and I could hear her crying before she even said hello. She asked what happened at Dad's presentation because he came home devastated 3 days ago. She said he's barely spoken since then and won't tell her what's wrong. Her voice cracked and she begged me to explain what happened. She said Dad just keeps saying his own kid destroyed him at work. I felt something twist in my chest hearing her cry like that. Mom had always made excuses for Dad, but now she sounded genuinely scared about what was going on with him. I told Mom exactly what I did during the panel and why I did it. I explained how I used Dad's own mockery against him in front of his colleagues. I expected her to defend him like she always did, to say he didn't mean it or I was being too sensitive. Instead, she was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was different, harder than I'd ever heard it. She said she knew Dad had been cruel about my achievements over the years. Then she said what I did was calculated and cold in a way that scared her. She asked if I understood what I'd done to him and hung up before I could answer. Wednesday afternoon, I got an email through official channels from Brady Harvey in HR at Dad's company. The subject line said statement required for investigation. He wrote that they needed a statement about what happened during the panel presentation. Dad filed a complaint about hostile work environment created by the panel process. Brady said they were conducting a formal investigation and I needed to come in to give my account of what occurred. My hands shook as I read the email. I forwarded it to Lila and she called me 5 minutes later. She said I needed to get a lawyer before I gave any statement and that our company's legal team would be in touch. Friday morning, I sat across from Brady in a small conference room at the accounting firm. He had a notepad in front of him and a recording device on the table between us. I gave my statement about using Dad's communication style to make a point about how his mockery felt. Brady wrote notes while I talked and didn't interrupt. When I finished, he looked up from his notepad. He said he understood I had personal issues with my father. Then he explained that regardless of my intentions, I created a situation where their employee was humiliated by a vendor consultant. He said that was a serious problem for their company. Brady asked if I understood the professional boundaries I'd violated. I nodded and signed the statement he'd typed up. Walking out of that building, I felt the weight of what I'd done settling on my shoulders in a way it hadn't before. I got to my desk Monday morning and found an email from the accounting firm's legal department sitting in my inbox. The subject line said formal complaint regarding panel conduct, and my stomach twisted when I opened it. They laid out everything that happened during Dad's presentation in careful legal language that made my mockery sound even worse than I remembered. They detailed how I disrupted a professional hiring process and created a hostile environment for their employee. They were requesting a formal response from my company and an investigation into my conduct. I forwarded it to Lila immediately, and she called me into her office 20 minutes later. Her face was tight with anger when I walked in, and she had the email pulled up on her screen. She asked me if I understood the position I'd put our company in, and I started to explain, but she held up her hand to stop me. She said the accounting firm was threatening to end their partnership with us over this, and she had to spend her morning writing an apology letter for my behavior. She showed me the draft, and I could see how carefully she'd worded it to take responsibility without admitting legal fault. She said she'd defended me to upper management, but this was my final warning and any similar conduct would result in immediate termination. I nodded and apologized, but she just pointed at the door and told me to get back to work. Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a man's voice said it was Tyson. It took me a second to place the name, and then I realized it was Dad's poker buddy from all those years of hearing about their games. He said he needed to talk to me about what happened with Dad, and asked if I could meet him for coffee. I almost said no, but something in his voice made me agree. We met at a place near my office, and Tyson was already there when I arrived, looking older than I remembered from family gatherings. He ordered us both coffee, and then sat back in his chair studying me. He said he'd known my dad for 15 years through their poker group, and he'd watched Dad mock my achievements at every game. He said it always made him uncomfortable, but he never said anything because it wasn't his place. Then he leaned forward and his voice got harder. He said what I did at that panel was worse than anything Dad ever did to me, because mine was planned and calculated. Dad's mockery came from his own insecurity about never accomplishing much in his career, but I deliberately set up a situation to destroy him in front of his colleagues. Tyson kept talking and explained that Dad had been calling out sick from work for the past week because he couldn't face the people who witnessed what happened. He said Dad's confidence was completely shattered, and he'd stopped talking about work entirely, even with his closest friends. Tyson said he understood why I was angry after years of Dad's treatment, but revenge didn't actually fix anything. It just created new damage. He finished his coffee and told me I needed to think about whether humiliating Dad was worth what it cost both of us. Then he left, and I sat there alone with my thoughts getting heavier. I realized Dad hadn't called me once since the panel presentation happened, which was weird because he normally couldn't resist commenting on everything I did. The silence felt different from his mockery, heavier somehow, like the space between us had filled with something worse than his jokes. I kept checking my phone expecting a sarcastic text or a voicemail with his laugh, but there was nothing. The absence of his mockery made me understand for the first time that I'd actually hurt him in a way that went beyond just embarrassment. Wednesday morning, I got an email from Wilhelmina Brooks asking to schedule a call. I remembered her from the panel, the external consultant who'd looked increasingly uncomfortable as I mocked Dad's presentation. When we talked, she was professional but distant. She said she was withdrawing from the executive search process because what she witnessed at the panel made her too uncomfortable to continue working with the firm. She explained that she'd been hired to evaluate candidates objectively, but what happened with Dad and me turned the process into something personal and ugly. She said family issues shouldn't contaminate professional settings the way I'd allowed them to, and she couldn't be part of a search that had been compromised like that. She wished me well and hung up before I could respond. I sat staring at my phone, realizing that my revenge had damaged more than just Dad's reputation. It had affected other people's careers and the firm's hiring process. That evening, my fiancée came home from work and found me sitting on the couch staring at nothing. She sat down next to me and took my hand and said we needed to talk about what my revenge said about our future together. Her voice was gentle but serious, and she said she'd been thinking about what happened at the panel all week. She said she was worried that I was capable of such calculated cruelty when someone hurt me. She asked how she could trust that I wouldn't do something similar to her if we had a big fight or went through a rough patch in our marriage. She said she needed to know I could handle conflict in healthier ways than planning elaborate revenge. I felt something break inside me when she said that, and I started crying. I told her the revenge didn't feel satisfying at all like I thought it would, and now I just felt empty and ashamed. She pulled me close and held me while I cried and said healing from Dad's treatment required therapy, not revenge. She said she'd support me if I was willing to do the real work of processing my hurt instead of trying to inflict it on other people. Friday afternoon, Carson called my cell phone directly instead of going through official channels. His voice was tired when I answered, and he said he had news about Dad. He told me Dad had withdrawn his complaint against the firm and resigned effective immediately. Carson said Dad claimed in his resignation letter that he couldn't work somewhere that allowed him to be treated the way I'd treated him during the panel. But Carson said everyone knew the real reason was that Dad couldn't face the embarrassment of staying after what happened. Carson said he felt bad about the whole situation because he understood both sides, but there was nothing he could do to fix it now. He told me Dad had 20 years at that firm and walked away from all of it because of one presentation. Then he hung up and I sat there feeling sick. Mom called an hour later and this time her voice wasn't sad, it was angry. She said Dad's career was destroyed because of what I did, and I needed to understand the full consequences of my revenge. She said Dad was 53 years old, and he'd resigned without another job lined up. She asked how they were supposed to manage their mortgage and bills if he couldn't find something comparable at his age. She said Dad had spent 20 years building his reputation at that firm, and I'd ruined it in one afternoon. Her voice cracked, and she said she didn't know if she could forgive me for this, and then she hung up. I tried calling her back, but she didn't answer. The guilt hit me hard that night when I really thought about what I'd done. Dad's mockery had hurt me for 25 years, but it never actually damaged my career or my achievements. I still got promoted, still bought my house, still got engaged, all despite his jokes. But my revenge cost him his job of 20 years and destroyed his professional reputation. I wanted him to feel small like he'd made me feel all those years, but I hadn't thought about the real-world consequences beyond that moment of satisfaction. I'd focused so much on making him understand my pain that I didn't consider what it would actually cost him. Now he had no job and a ruined reputation, and I had to live with knowing I'd done that to him on purpose. I spent the next 3 days trying to reach Dad, but every call went straight to voicemail, and my texts stayed on delivered without any response. Each attempt made the guilt heavier, because I knew he was actively avoiding me and I couldn't blame him for it. Mom finally called back on Wednesday afternoon, and her voice sounded tired when she told me Dad wasn't ready to talk yet. She said the resignation broke something in him that she hadn't seen before, like he couldn't face being the person who got humiliated at work by his own kid. She didn't know when he'd be ready to hear from me, and honestly, she wasn't sure he ever would be. The way she said it made me understand that this wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. It was about Dad's entire sense of who he was getting destroyed in front of his colleagues. I thanked her for telling me and hung up feeling worse than before, because at least when I didn't know, I could pretend he might answer eventually. Lila called me into her office Friday morning and closed the door behind us, which immediately told me this wasn't good news. She sat down and pulled up an email on her screen before turning it toward me so I could read it. The accounting firm was ending their partnership with our company, effective immediately because of what happened during the panel presentation. They cited breach of professional conduct and said they couldn't continue working with a firm that allowed consultants to use business settings for personal vendettas. Lila's face was hard when she told me this was going to cost us a contract worth over $200,000 annually. She said the executive team decided I was reassigned to a different division where I wouldn't have any contact with external partners or clients. My role in consulting was done, and I'd be moving to internal systems development starting Monday. She didn't yell or get emotional, just stated the facts and told me I was lucky they didn't terminate me entirely given the damage I'd caused. I left her office understanding that my revenge didn't just hurt Dad, it hurt my own career and my colleagues who depended on that contract. My fiancé brought up therapy that weekend while we were sitting on the couch, not really watching the movie playing on TV. She said she'd been thinking about everything that happened, and she was worried about me going into our marriage carrying this much anger and hurt. She told me she loved me, but she needed to see that I was committed to being better than the pain Dad had caused me over the years. The way she looked at me when she said it made me realize she was genuinely scared that I might handle conflicts in our marriage the same way I handled this situation with Dad. She suggested I find a therapist who specialized in family stuff before the wedding so I could work through 25 years of feeling dismissed and mocked. I agreed because I could see in her eyes that this wasn't just a suggestion, it was something she needed from me if we were going to move forward. I found a therapist the following week through my insurance and scheduled an appointment for that Thursday afternoon. The office was in a building downtown, and the waiting room had those generic calming paintings that every therapy office seems to have. The therapist was older with gray hair and glasses, and she had me fill out intake forms before we started talking. I spent the first session just explaining the history with Dad, all the slow claps and mockery and how it felt to have every achievement treated like a joke. She listened without interrupting and took notes occasionally, but mostly just let me talk. When I got to the part about the panel presentation, she asked me what I thought I'd accomplish by doing that to him. I told her I wanted him to understand how his mockery felt, and she nodded slowly before saying that revenge from a place of hurt doesn't actually heal anything. It just spreads the pain around. She said Dad's behavior was clearly about his own insecurities, but my response was about making him hurt the way I hurt, which meant I was still letting his opinion define my worth. That hit harder than I expected because I realized she was right. Tyson called again 2 weeks into my therapy sessions, and his voice sounded strained when I answered. He said Dad had been applying for accounting positions at other firms, but he kept bombing the interviews because his confidence was completely destroyed. Tyson told me he'd gone to lunch with Dad the previous week and watched him try to talk about his professional achievements, but his voice started shaking, and he had to stop. He said it was painful to watch because Dad was actually good at his work. He just lost the ability to advocate for himself after what happened at the panel. Tyson wasn't calling to make me feel guilty, he said, but he wanted me to understand that Dad couldn't even function professionally anymore. I thanked him for letting me know, and sat there after the call thinking about how I'd taken away the one thing Dad seemed to value about himself. The realization came slowly over the next few days as I processed what Tyson had said. I took away Dad's career pride the same way his mockery tried to take away my pride in my achievements. The symmetry of it should have felt satisfying, but instead it made everything worse because I proved I could hurt him, but I didn't prove anything about my actual worth. All those years of accomplishments were real, regardless of whether Dad acknowledged them, but now I'd destroyed his career, and that was real too. The revenge didn't make me feel better about myself. It just made me someone who could calculate how to hurt another person in the place they felt most vulnerable. I brought this up in therapy, and my therapist helped me see that I was still measuring my value against Dad's opinion, just in a different way now. Mom sent me a text message 3 weeks after Dad resigned, and it was short and direct. They were selling the house because they couldn't afford the mortgage without Dad's income from his old job. She said she wasn't trying to make me feel guilty, but she wanted me to understand the full impact of what happened at that panel. The house I grew up in, where Mom had lived for 30 years, was going on the market because I'd cost Dad his career. I read the text 5 times and each time it felt heavier. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or damaged pride anymore. It was about real financial consequences that would change their entire lives. I wanted to call her, but I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like empty apologies or excuses. My fiancé and I had a long conversation that night about the wedding, and she suggested we postpone it until I was in a better emotional place. She said she was supportive of me working through this in therapy, but she needed to see real change in how I handled conflict before we made that commitment to each other. The way she said it was gentle but firm, and I understood she was drawing a boundary about what she'd accept in our relationship. We agreed to push the wedding back 6 months and use that time for me to continue therapy and for us to do some couples counseling together. She told me she loved me and believed I could do the work, but she needed to see it actually happening, not just hear me say I would change. In therapy over the following weeks, I worked on understanding that Dad's mockery was never really about me or what I accomplished. My therapist helped me see that Dad was afraid his own achievements weren't enough, that he'd spent 20 years at an accounting firm doing solid work, but never becoming a partner or getting major recognition. When I succeeded in ways he never did, it highlighted his own perceived failures, and he dealt with that by diminishing my accomplishments. The therapist said my revenge came from that same place of inadequacy, trying to prove something about my worth by making him hurt. She helped me understand that seeking validation through revenge just kept the cycle going because I was still letting Dad's opinion matter more than my own assessment of my achievements. Brady contacted me 5 weeks after the panel incident through a professional email to my work address. He said Dad's former colleagues had been asking questions about what happened, and the story was spreading through their professional network in ways that made both Dad and me look bad. People were hearing different versions and filling in gaps with speculation that painted us both as unprofessional and vindictive. Brady suggested I might want to reach out to Dad directly before the narrative got worse and damaged both our reputations beyond repair. He said this as someone who understood family dynamics could get messy, but also as an HR professional who'd seen how workplace conflicts could follow people for years. I thanked him for the heads up and sat staring at my computer screen, trying to figure out how to reach someone who wouldn't answer my calls or respond to my messages. I opened my laptop and started typing the letter to Dad, deleting and rewriting the first sentence at least 10 times. Each version felt either too defensive or too apologetic, and I couldn't find the right balance between acknowledging what I'd done and explaining why I'd done it. I finally settled on starting simple, just telling him I was sorry for what happened at the panel and that I wanted him to understand my perspective, even though I knew it didn't excuse my behavior. The words came easier after that, and I wrote about how his mockery had accumulated over 25 years until I couldn't see my own achievements as real anymore, just as jokes waiting for his punchline. I explained that I'd wanted him to feel what I felt, to understand how it crushed something inside me every time he laughed at the things I was proud of, but I acknowledged that public humiliation at his workplace was wrong regardless of my reasons. I didn't try to minimize what I'd cost him or pretend the consequences weren't severe, just admitted that I'd been angry and hurt and handled it in the worst possible way. I printed the letter and addressed an envelope, staring at his name written in my handwriting and wondering if he'd even open it or just throw it away. I mailed it the next day and then spent the following week checking my phone constantly, waiting for a response that never came. Mom called 2 weeks after I sent the letter, and her voice sounded tired in a way that made my chest tight. She told me Dad had read the letter multiple times, that she'd found him in his study late at night with it spread out on his desk, and once she'd walked in to find him crying with the pages in his hands. She said he was starting to recognize how much damage his mockery had done over the years, really seeing it clearly for the first time instead of brushing it off as harmless jokes. But she also said he was struggling with the fact that his own behavior had led directly to what I did at the panel, that he'd created the situation that destroyed his career, even if I was the one who executed it. Mom's voice cracked when she told me Dad kept saying he didn't know how to fix what he'd broken in me, and now I'd broken something in him, and maybe neither of them could be repaired. She didn't sound angry anymore, just sad and exhausted, like she'd been carrying too much weight for too long, and finally had to set it down. Tyson called me 3 months after the panel incident, and I almost didn't answer because I figured he was calling to tell me what a terrible person I was. Instead, he said Dad had finally gotten a job offer at a smaller accounting firm across town with significantly lower pay and fewer benefits. Dad was taking it because they needed the income after burning through most of their savings during the job search, but everyone in their professional circle knew it was a major step down from where he'd been. Tyson said Dad's former colleagues had been asking questions about why he left so suddenly, and the rumors ranged from performance issues to personal scandals, none of them close to the truth, but all of them damaging. He told me Dad went to the new office every day looking defeated, like someone had taken away the one thing he felt confident about and left him scrambling to rebuild from nothing. Tyson wasn't calling to make me feel guilty, he said, just to let me know that the consequences were still unfolding and Dad was paying for his behavior in ways that went beyond just losing his job. I sat in my therapist's office working through the complicated mess of guilt and anger that came with knowing Dad was suffering because of what I'd done. The therapist helped me understand that my self-worth couldn't be tied to either Dad's approval or his mockery, that I'd accomplished everything despite his behavior rather than because of any motivation it provided. She walked me through my achievements one by one, asking me to describe what I'd done to earn each one and how it felt in the moment before Dad's reaction. I talked about studying for hours to make honor roll, practicing soccer until my legs ached, working late nights on projects that led to my promotion, and she made me see that all of that was real, regardless of how Dad responded to it. She said Dad's opinion didn't change the validity of my achievements any more than a stranger's opinion would, but I'd given him power over how I saw my own success by needing his validation. The work was slow and frustrating because every time I thought I'd separated my worth from his judgment, another memory would surface of him laughing at something I'd been proud of, and I'd feel that same crushing doubt. My fiancé and I started couples counseling the following month because she needed to know I could handle hurt and anger in healthier ways before we got married. The counselor asked us both what we needed from each other, and my fiancé said she needed to see me develop better coping mechanisms for when I felt dismissed or attacked, because revenge wasn't something she could live with in our marriage. I told her I needed to prove to both of us that I was capable of breaking the patterns I'd grown up with, that I wouldn't become the kind of person who hurt others when I was hurting. The sessions were hard because they forced me to look at how my relationship with Dad had shaped the way I handled conflict in general, always either swallowing my feelings or eventually exploding with disproportionate responses. My fiancé shared that she'd been scared after the panel incident, not just of what I'd done to Dad, but of what it meant about how I might handle disagreements between us in the future. We worked on communication strategies and healthy boundaries, and slowly I started to understand that healing from Dad's treatment required building new patterns rather than just avoiding the old ones. Carson reached out 6 weeks after the panel through a carefully worded email saying he'd been thinking about what happened and wanted to understand my perspective better. I was surprised he'd contact me at all after how everything went down, but I agreed to meet him for coffee at a place halfway between our offices. We sat across from each other in a corner booth, and I explained the full history of Dad's mockery, starting with that first slow clap in 6th grade and continuing through every achievement he'd dismissed or laughed at. Carson listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from uncomfortable to understanding as I described 25 years of having my accomplishments treated as punchlines. I told him about the wedding speech where Dad predicted my divorce in front of everyone we knew, and how that had been the moment I decided he needed to experience what his mockery actually felt like. Carson nodded slowly when I finished and said he appreciated me being honest about my motivations, even though it didn't change the fact that what I'd done was wrong. Carson leaned back in his seat and said he'd grown up with a father who was hypercritical of everything he did, never satisfied with any achievement, and always pointing out what could have been better. He described how that kind of parental dismissiveness created lasting damage that showed up in unexpected ways throughout his adult life, making him second-guess his decisions and constantly seek validation from others. He said he understood why I'd snapped after years of Dad's mockery, that there was only so much a person could take before they hit a breaking point and did something they'd regret. But he also said what I'd done was still wrong because I'd planned it deliberately rather than just losing my temper, and that calculation made it harder to justify even with the context of Dad's behavior. He told me he hoped both Dad and I could find a way to heal from this, because carrying that kind of pain around just poisoned everything else in life, and we both deserved better than to be defined by the worst things we'd done to each other. Mom called a month later and asked if I'd come to dinner, saying Dad was ready to talk to me. My hands started shaking when I heard that because I'd been waiting for this conversation, but also dreading it, knowing it would be painful regardless of how it went. I agreed to come over that Friday evening, and I spent the days leading up to it rehearsing what I'd say and imagining every possible way the conversation could unfold. I drove to their house feeling like my stomach was full of rocks, parking in the driveway and sitting in my car for 5 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Mom answered the door and hugged me tight, whispering that Dad was nervous too and to please be patient with him. I walked into the dining room and saw Dad sitting at the table staring at his hands, and the whole scene felt surreal after months of him refusing to speak to me. The dinner was silent and awkward for the first 20 minutes, with all of us pushing food around our plates and making occasional comments about nothing important. Dad barely looked at me, keeping his eyes on his plate or the wall behind my head, and I could see how much effort it took him just to be in the same room. Mom tried to start conversations about neutral topics, but they all died quickly, and the tension kept building until it felt like the air was too thick to breathe. Dad set down his fork and cleared his throat, and I knew this was it. The conversation we'd been avoiding was about to happen whether we were ready for it or not. He said he'd been thinking about all the times he'd mocked my achievements, really examining each incident, and trying to understand why he'd done it, and he was starting to see why I'd done what I did at the panel, even though it had destroyed him professionally. Dad's voice was quiet and strained as he admitted that my accomplishments had highlighted his own perceived failures, that watching me succeed in ways he never had made him feel small and inadequate. He said seeing me get a full ride to graduate school when he'd never finished his bachelor's degree, watching me buy a house at 26. When he'd been 35, knowing I'd gotten promoted faster than he ever had in his entire career, all of it had made him feel like he hadn't done enough with his life. He explained that mocking my achievements was his way of protecting himself from that feeling, of convincing himself that my success didn't count as much as his own smaller victories because standards had dropped or I'd gotten lucky. He looked at me directly for the first time and said it was never really about me or what I'd accomplished. It was about his own fear that he wasn't enough. And never would be, and he'd dealt with that by trying to make my achievements seem less significant. He said it didn't excuse his behavior, and he knew the damage he'd done couldn't be undone. But he wanted me to know the mockery had never been because my accomplishments weren't real or impressive. It was because they were too real, and it terrified him. I sat there staring at my plate while Dad's words hung in the air between us. Mom reached over and squeezed both our hands, and the gesture felt like she was trying to hold us together physically, since we couldn't manage it emotionally. I cleared my throat and forced myself to look at Dad directly, instead of at the wall behind his head. I told him I was sorry again for what happened at the panel, that I wanted him to feel the same shame and smallness he'd made me feel for years, but I didn't think about what it would actually cost him. Dad nodded slowly and said he understood why I did it, even though it destroyed everything he'd built at that firm. We both sat there acknowledging out loud that we'd hurt each other badly, and neither of us had handled our pain in anything close to a healthy way. The admission felt heavy and uncomfortable, but also necessary, like lancing an infected wound that had been festering for decades. Dad pushed his food around his plate and said he wasn't ready to forgive me yet for costing him his career. His voice was quiet but firm, and I respected the honesty even though it stung. I told him I wasn't ready to forgive him for 25 years of mockery either, that we couldn't just erase that damage with one conversation. Mom looked like she wanted to push us toward reconciliation faster, but she stayed quiet and let us navigate this ourselves. Dad and I agreed that maybe forgiveness wasn't something we could reach right now, but understanding each other better was at least a starting point. We finished dinner in relative silence, but it felt different from the tension at the beginning, more like we were both processing instead of avoiding. The next few months passed in a strange pattern of occasional phone calls that felt stilted but honest. Dad would call on Tuesday evenings usually, and we'd talk about surface things at first before gradually getting into harder topics. He told me about his therapy sessions, and how his therapist was helping him understand why he'd needed to diminish my achievements to protect his own ego. I shared what my therapist was saying about how revenge doesn't actually heal the original hurt, it just creates new hurt for everyone involved. Our conversations were awkward, and sometimes one of us would get defensive and we'd have to back off and try again later. But slowly we started talking about things that didn't revolve entirely around the panel incident or his years of mockery. We talked about work and life, and slowly started to remember that we were related by more than just our mutual damage. My fiancé and I had a long conversation about the wedding and what it meant to be moving forward with marriage while I was still working through so much family stuff. She suggested we postpone until the following year to give me more time in counseling and to make sure I was really making progress. I felt disappointed at first because I wanted to prove I could move forward, but I also knew she was right. We rescheduled everything and told our families we needed more time to work through some personal issues. My fiancé said she could see me making real progress in how I handled difficult emotions, and that made her optimistic about our future together. She wasn't giving up on me, just asking me to do the work before we made a permanent commitment. I appreciated that she was willing to wait, while also holding me accountable for actually changing. Dad settled into his new job at the smaller firm, and I heard updates through Mom and Tyson about how he was doing. Tyson called me one afternoon and said Dad seemed different now, less interested in bragging about small victories and more genuine when he talked about his work. He said the humiliation had forced Dad to examine his behavior in ways he never did before when everything was comfortable. Tyson thought Dad was actually becoming a better version of himself, even though the path there had been brutal for everyone involved. I didn't know how to feel about that. Glad Dad was changing, but guilty that it took destroying his career to make it happen. Mom echoed similar observations, saying Dad was quieter but also more present, actually listening when she talked instead of waiting for his turn to talk about himself. 6 months after the panel incident, I got promoted at work despite the reassignment to a different division. Lila called me into her office and said my work had been exceptional and they were moving me up with a significant raise. I felt proud but also nervous about telling Dad because I didn't know how he'd react. I called him that evening and told him about the promotion, bracing myself for some version of his old mockery, even though we'd been making progress. Instead, he congratulated me without any sarcasm or edge to his voice. He said he was proud of me and that I'd earned it through hard work. I felt my throat get tight and had to take a second before I could respond because it was the first genuine acknowledgement of my achievements I'd ever gotten from him. We talked for a few more minutes about the new role and responsibilities, and the whole conversation felt surreal in how normal and supportive it was. Mom called me a week later to tell me about Dad's therapy sessions and how he talked about the panel incident as a turning point. She said his therapist had him examining all the times he'd mocked my accomplishments and recognizing the pattern of behavior he'd been perpetuating. Dad apparently told his therapist that seeing his own tactics used against him made him understand for the first time how cruel and diminishing they actually were. Mom said it was painful to watch him work through all that guilt and shame, but she thought both of us needed something to break the cycle we'd been stuck in. She wasn't excusing what I did, but she also wasn't excusing his decades of mockery, just acknowledging that we'd both contributed to a toxic dynamic that needed to end. Dad called me 6 months after our first dinner conversation, and his voice sounded different, more settled somehow. He said he'd been thinking about all my achievements over the years and going through them one by one in therapy. He told me he was genuinely proud of everything I'd accomplished, from honor roll in 6th grade to my current promotion. His voice cracked when he said he was sorry it took public humiliation for him to recognize what he'd been doing to me all those years. I sat on my couch listening and felt tears running down my face because I'd waited my whole life to hear those words. We talked for over an hour about specific memories and moments where his mockery had cut deep, and he apologized for each one individually. I told Dad I was sorry too, that it took calculated revenge for me to express how much his mockery hurt me instead of finding healthier ways to communicate. I said I wished we'd both been brave enough to have honest conversations years ago instead of letting the hurt build until it exploded in the worst possible way. Dad agreed, and we both acknowledged that we couldn't undo the damage we'd done to each other, but we could try to build something better going forward. The conversation felt like a real turning point, not just surface reconciliation, but actual understanding of how we'd both failed each other. We agreed to keep working in therapy and to keep having these honest conversations even when they were uncomfortable. My fiancé suggested we all meet together to talk about boundaries before the rescheduled wedding. She wanted to make sure Dad and I were on the same page about how we'd handle family events going forward. We met at a restaurant halfway between our houses and sat down with coffee while my fiancé laid out her expectations. She said she wouldn't tolerate mockery or revenge in our family, and that both Dad and I needed to commit to healthier communication patterns. Dad and I both agreed immediately because we'd been working toward exactly that in our individual therapy sessions. My fiancé asked specific questions about how we'd handle disagreements and what we'd do if old patterns started creeping back in. We talked through scenarios and made concrete plans for how to support each other in staying accountable to the changes we were making. Dad called me 2 weeks after that dinner meeting and asked if we could talk about the wedding. I expected another excuse or maybe an attempt to back out of the conversation we'd started. Instead, he told me he wanted to contribute money toward the wedding costs as an apology for his engagement party speech. His voice sounded different, quieter somehow, without the usual edge of mockery. He said he'd been thinking about what he said that night, about predicting our divorce and making jokes about how long we'd last. He told me it was cruel, and he wanted to make it right in whatever way he could. I sat there holding my phone, not sure how to respond because this was the first time Dad had ever acknowledged his behavior and tried to fix it. I told him he didn't have to do that, but he insisted he wanted to help pay for the venue or the catering or whatever we needed. I accepted his offer because it felt like a real gesture, not just empty words. My fiancé was surprised when I told her, and she said it showed he was serious about changing. We picked out a nicer venue than we'd originally planned since Dad's contribution made it possible. My next therapy session focused on something I'd been avoiding for months. The therapist asked me if the revenge at the panel had actually healed the hurt from Dad's years of mockery. I wanted to say yes, that seeing him stumble through his presentation while I laughed had made everything better. But sitting there in that office, I had to admit the truth. The revenge created new hurt for both of us without fixing the old wounds. I told the therapist about the satisfaction I felt in that conference room, watching Dad's face go white when I walked in. I described how good it felt to use his own tactics against him, to make him feel small the way he'd made me feel small for 25 years. But then I had to talk about everything that came after. Dad losing his job, Mom crying on the phone, my fiancé looking at me differently. The therapist helped me understand that healing required processing the pain, not passing it on to someone else. She said revenge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I'd hurt Dad badly, but I was still carrying all the same hurt he'd given me over the years. The only difference was now I had guilt and shame on top of everything else. Dad and I started having monthly dinners after that conversation about the wedding money. We picked a restaurant halfway between our houses and agreed to meet there on the first Friday of every month. The first dinner was so awkward I almost left twice. We sat across from each other, barely making eye contact, ordering food we didn't really want. Dad asked about my job and I gave short answers. I asked about his new position and he did the same. Everything felt forced and uncomfortable, like we were strangers trying to have a conversation. But we kept showing up every month because we'd both committed to trying. By the third dinner, we could talk about basic stuff without the tension being so thick. By the sixth dinner, Dad told me about a problem he was having at work and actually asked for my advice. I gave him some suggestions about updating their digital systems, and he listened without making jokes or dismissing what I said. We still had moments where old patterns crept in. He'd start to make a sarcastic comment and catch himself. I'd feel defensive about something small and have to breathe through it. But gradually, we found we could talk about our lives without everything turning into a judgment or a mockery. My fiancée pulled me aside one night after I got home from therapy and told me she wanted to talk. I braced myself for bad news because her tone was serious. Instead, she said she was proud of the work I'd been doing. She told me she could see real changes in how I handled conflict and hurt. When her mom made a passive-aggressive comment at dinner the week before, I'd stayed calm instead of getting defensive. When my project at work got criticized, I took the feedback without spiraling into self-doubt. She said these things seemed small, but they showed I was learning healthier ways to deal with difficult emotions. Then she said something that made me tear up. She told me she was excited to marry me now that she knew we could work through hard things together. For months after the panel incident, she'd been scared that I'd handle our inevitable conflicts with the same calculated cruelty I'd shown Dad. Watching me do the therapy work and seeing actual changes had given her confidence in our future. We set a new wedding date for the following spring, giving us time to finish the couples counseling we'd started. The wedding day arrived on a perfect April morning with clear skies and warm sun. I stood at the altar watching my fiancé walk down the aisle and felt genuinely happy for the first time in over a year. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, exactly what we'd wanted. But the moment that stuck with me came during the reception when Dad stood up to give his speech. The room got quiet, and I felt my stomach tighten, remembering his engagement party speech where he joked about our divorce. Dad looked nervous, holding his note cards with shaking hands. He started by saying he'd given a speech at our engagement party that he deeply regretted. Then he talked about watching me grow up and accomplish things he'd never dreamed of achieving. He listed specific achievements, my honor roll certificates, my soccer trophies, my college acceptance, my graduate degree, my job promotions, my house purchase. His voice cracked when he said he was genuinely proud of everything I'd accomplished and ashamed that it took him so long to say it out loud. He talked about the person I'd become, someone who worked hard and treated people with kindness, even when life was difficult. He said he was honored to be my father and grateful that I'd given him another chance after he'd spent years being the father I deserved. Several family members came up to me afterward saying they'd never heard Dad talk that way before. His brother told me Dad had been practicing that speech for weeks, wanting to get every word right. After the wedding, Dad and I kept up our monthly dinners and added something new. We started going to family therapy sessions together every other week. The therapist specialized in parent-child relationships and helped us navigate the complicated process of rebuilding trust. Some sessions were productive and we'd leave feeling like we'd made progress. Other sessions were hard, with both of us getting defensive or falling back into old patterns. Dad struggled with accepting responsibility for how his mockery had damaged me. I struggled with letting go of my anger and resentment. The therapist kept reminding us that change was difficult and backsliding was normal. What mattered was that we kept showing up and kept trying. We created new patterns slowly, learning to communicate without attacking each other. When Dad felt insecure about something, he practiced saying that directly instead of making jokes at my expense. When I felt hurt by something he said, I practiced telling him calmly instead of planning revenge. It wasn't perfect, and we still had rough moments, but we were both committed to breaking the patterns that had damaged us for so long. A year after the panel incident, I attended a professional conference for tech consultants downtown. I was standing in line for coffee when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around and saw Carson standing there with a conference badge. We both looked surprised, and he asked if we could talk for a minute. We found a quiet corner away from the crowds, and Carson asked how things were going with Dad. I told him we'd been working on rebuilding our relationship through therapy and monthly dinners. Carson nodded and said he was glad we were both getting help. He told me what he'd witnessed that day in the conference room clearly came from deep pain on both sides. He said he'd thought a lot about that panel over the past year, about how family dynamics can poison professional situations. Carson shared that he'd started therapy himself to work through issues with his own father. He said watching Dad and me destroy each other had made him realize he didn't want to end up in a similar situation. We talked for about 20 minutes about family relationships and the work it takes to heal them. Before he left, Carson said he hoped Dad and I could find our way to something better than what we'd had before. Dad called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual because we normally only talk during our scheduled dinners. His voice sounded excited in a way I hadn't heard in years. He told me he'd gotten a small promotion at his new firm, moving from senior accountant to accounting manager. It wasn't a huge jump, but it meant more responsibility and a modest pay increase. I could hear genuine pride in his voice as he described the new role and what it would involve. I congratulated him enthusiastically, telling him I was happy for him and that he deserved the recognition. We talked for a while about what the promotion meant and how it would change his day-to-day work. As we were wrapping up the call, Dad said something that made both of us pause. He told me this was the first time we'd talked about an achievement without using it as a weapon against each other. We were learning to celebrate each other's successes instead of tearing them down. I agreed and told him it felt good to be genuinely happy for him without any resentment or bitterness mixed in. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about how far we'd come from that conference room where I'd mocked everything he said. My fiancé and I celebrated our first anniversary with a weekend trip to the coast. We walked on the beach and had dinner at a nice restaurant overlooking the water. That night in our hotel room, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened over the past 2 years. The revenge at the panel had almost destroyed my relationship with Dad and seriously damaged my relationship with her, but it had also forced changes that needed to happen. If I hadn't humiliated Dad in that conference room, we might have kept going the way we'd always gone, with him mocking my achievements and me building up resentment. The explosion was terrible and hurt everyone involved, but it broke the pattern we'd been stuck in for 25 years. I was grateful we'd all done the hard work to heal instead of letting the hurt define us forever. My fiancé asked what I was thinking about, and I told her. She said she was proud of how much work I'd put into therapy and into rebuilding my relationship with Dad. She told me the person I'd become over the past year was someone she was excited to build a life with. I sat in my therapist's office for what felt like the 100th time, but this session was different. We'd been working for over a year on processing everything related to Dad and the panel incident. The therapist asked me where I was now with all of it, how I felt about what Dad had done and what I'd done in response. I took a long time to answer because I wanted to get it right. I told her that Dad's mockery had damaged me in ways I was still discovering. His constant dismissal of my achievements had made me doubt my own worth and seek validation in unhealthy ways. But I'd finally accepted that his mockery didn't define my worth. My accomplishments were real regardless of whether he acknowledged them. At the same time, I'd accepted that my revenge had damaged him, but didn't define my character. I'd done something cruel and calculated, but that wasn't who I wanted to be going forward. The therapist nodded and said this was the work, accepting that we're all more than the worst things we've done to each other. Dad and I were both capable of change if we chose to do the hard work. I was choosing it every day in therapy and in our monthly dinners. Dad was choosing it in his own therapy and in how he talked to me now. We both carried scars from what we'd done to each other, but we were learning to use those scars as reminders to treat each other better. A month after our anniversary trip, Dad called me and asked if I wanted to go fishing. We hadn't done that since I was maybe 10 years old, back before everything got complicated between us. I said yes without thinking too much about it because something in his voice sounded different, like he was actually nervous about asking me. We met at the lake early on a Saturday morning, and Dad had already rented a boat and bought bait. He looked older than I remembered, more tired around the eyes, but he smiled when he saw me, and it reached his eyes for once. We loaded our stuff into the boat and headed out to the middle of the lake where Dad said the fish were biting lately. For the first hour, we just fished in comfortable silence, which was nice because we didn't have to force conversation or pretend everything was perfect. Eventually, Dad started talking about how he'd been going to therapy twice a week and working through a lot of stuff about his own dad, who apparently never told him he was proud of anything either. He said he finally understood that he'd been passing down the same hurt his father gave him, just in a different form. I listened and kept my eyes on my fishing line because it was easier than looking at him while he said these things. Dad told me he was genuinely proud of everything I'd accomplished, from making honor roll in 6th grade to buying my house to marrying someone who clearly made me happy. He said his actions would back up his words from now on because words without actions were just empty noise. I believed him this time because he'd been proving it for months now with the phone calls and the genuine congratulations and the therapy work he was doing. We caught a few fish and threw them back, and by the time we headed back to shore, I felt like maybe we'd turned a real corner together. The next week, I sat in my therapist's office and worked through something I'd been avoiding for months. The slow clap revenge had given me one moment of satisfaction when I watched Dad stumble through his presentation, but it cost me so much more than that. I'd spent months feeling guilty about destroying his career and damaging my relationship with my fiancé and almost losing my own job. Multiple relationships got hurt because I couldn't find a healthier way to express my pain. The therapist helped me see that the real victory wasn't making Dad feel small like he'd made me feel. The real victory was learning to build self-worth that didn't require his approval or his mockery or my revenge against him. My achievements were real and valuable because I accomplished them, not because Dad finally acknowledged them or because I got even with him for dismissing them. I'd spent so long seeking validation from someone who couldn't give it that I forgot to validate myself. The therapist said this was the hardest work, learning to recognize your own worth without needing external proof. I left that session feeling lighter than I had in years because I finally understood that Dad's opinion of me, good or bad, didn't define what I'd actually achieved. 3 days later, Mom sent me a picture that made me stop in the middle of my workday and just stare at my phone. Dad had framed my graduate school diploma, the one he'd laughed so hard about that he cried and hung it in his home office right next to his own Employee of the Month certificate. Mom's text said he'd been telling everyone who visited about my accomplishments now, with genuine pride instead of the mockery he used to use. She said people who came over for dinner or stopped by to drop something off would get a full tour of my achievements, and Dad would light up talking about my tech career and my house and my marriage. It was strange to think about Dad showing off the things he used to ridicule, but Mom said the change was real and consistent. She told me he'd even called some of his old poker buddies to apologize for the way he used to talk about me at their games. I saved the picture on my phone and looked at it whenever I needed a reminder that people could actually change if they did the work. 2 years after the panel incident, Dad and I had monthly dinners where we talked honestly about our lives without the constant undercurrent of judgment. We'd built something new based on honesty and mutual respect instead of mockery and revenge. Neither of us pretended the past didn't happen or that we hadn't seriously hurt each other. We both carried scars from what we'd done, him from 25 years of dismissing my achievements, and me from publicly destroying his career in that conference room. But we were using those scars as reminders to treat each other with the kindness we both deserved all along. Dad still struggled sometimes with his instinct to deflect compliments with jokes, and I still struggled with my instinct to protect myself by keeping him at a distance. The difference was we both caught ourselves now and corrected course instead of letting those patterns take over. We weren't perfect, and our relationship would probably never be easy, but it was real and honest in a way it never had been before. At our last dinner, Dad told me he was grateful the panel incident happened, because it forced both of us to face things we'd been avoiding for decades, and I had to admit he was right, even though the path to get here was painful for everyone involved.